All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual presentation entitled COP26 and Net Zero's Dangerous Distractions. This event is being held to coincide with the International COP26 event in Glasgow, Scotland, running from October 31st to November 12th. We at Climate Action Muskoka are co-sponsoring this event with two other organizations, Environment Halliburton and Seniors for Climate Action Now. My name is Sue McKenzie. I am one of the founders of Climate Action Muskoka, and I am your host for this evening. Tonight, respectfully, we honor all Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit for their cultures, their languages, their wise teachings and ways of being, their stewardship and protection of the lands and waters and life that have shaped this country since time began. Together, we commit to acknowledge, to learn, to educate, to create opportunity, and to honor sacred places, and to take actions towards real truth and reconciliation in support of our commitment to wellness for all and to walking the path together in respect, peace, and harmony for future generations. I would like to acknowledge that here in South Muskoka, I am on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Anishinaabe, specifically the Chippewa and Ojibwa. I also recognize the more recent stewardship of the Mohawks of Waka and the Potawatomi of Moose Deer Point. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the organizations that have come together to make this evening happen. Climate Action Muskoka, CAM, is an inclusive, nonpartisan group formed in November 2019 to drive climate solutions in the District of Muskoka. Since then, due to CAM's efforts, climate emergencies have been declared unanimously by the District of Muskoka and each of the lower tier municipalities to achieve a 50% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030, reaching zero, not net zero, by 2050. CAM has also launched a community carbon challenge to educate and promote GHG reduction action by individuals and businesses in Muskoka. Environment Halliburton is based in Halliburton, Ontario, and over the 17 years since its founding has kept environmental matters in focus in the community and has advocated, lobbied, educated, and acted as consultants on many environmental matters, including climate change. Two of its founding members, Carolyn Coburn and Eric Lilius, are still hard at work with us tonight, as are President Susan Hay and Vice President Terry Moore. Seniors for Climate Action Now is a recently formed climate action group based in Ontario, whose mandate is to inform and mobilize seniors in an effort to prevent more climate catastrophes. Young people are calling on governments to act decisively on the climate emergency. SCAN will support their lead, amplify their voices, and add their own to the growing movement for climate action and climate justice. David Robertson and Gail Greer, whom you will meet tonight, are members of SCAN. Now that we're all introduced, let's get a little business out of the way. First of all, Eric Lilius of Environment Halliburton is looking after the Zoom controls, and he has you all muted. Terry Moore is wearing two hats this evening since he's also a member of the SCAN Education Committee and will moderate the presentations and discussions this evening. As well, he's the host of the excellent Planet Halliburton Environmental Justice radio program and podcast on Canoe FM in Halliburton. Terry will be taking questions from the chat box tonight. We respectfully request that you reserve the chat box for questions and any additional info links you wish to share, such as links to your group's website or upcoming events. Feel free to type questions as you think of them during the presentations. Just a note that our guest speaker, Marc Lee, must leave by 8:45. Should you wish to copy the chat box at the end of the evening, click on the three dots at the bottom of the box. There is a save chat function there. I think that's about everything. And now I'm going to hand the meeting over to Terry to kick off the presentations.
Thank you, Sue. I got myself unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The main focus of tonight's event is a critical assessment of the Net Zero 250 framework for driving down carbon emissions that's become central to corporate and governmental climate pledges in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow. Since net zero related issues like carbon markets and offsets will be front and center at the summit, we thought we'd start off with a short presentation about some of the key debates to watch out for as events unfold over the next couple of weeks. To that end, David Robertson, a member of the SCAN Education Committee and co-author of SCAN's April 2021 analysis of the Liberal Climate Action Plan subtitled A Recipe for Failure, will start things off tonight with a short COP26 backgrounder. With that, I'm going to turn things over to David.
Thank you, Terry. And I am going to share a screen if... Who the hell? Well, thanks to Terry and thanks to all of you for showing up and being part of this event tonight. The focus of tonight's presentation is net zero by 2050. To help set the stage, my task is to briefly highlight a number of the issues that are on the COP26 agenda. COP26 starts in 3 days. Net zero by 2050 is almost 30 years away. But those 2 dates are actually closer than they seem, because COP26 is a pivot point. For the last 5 years, climate goal was COP26 1.5 degrees, COP26 1.5 degrees. Now that COP has failed to reduce emissions, the new climate mantra has shifted to net zero by 2050. COP stands for the Conference of the Parties. The parties are the signatories of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed way back in 1994. COP26 is going to be the test of the Paris Accord. Recall that the Paris Agreement, forged at COP21 in 2015, was a major climate breakthrough on 2 major fronts. First of all, it committed to limit global warming to considerably less than 2 degrees and preferably 1.5. And it committed every country in the world to set emission reduction targets to achieve that and to escalate those targets every 5 years. COP26 is now the 5-year mark. A lot goes on in the halls and the corridors of COP26. Perhaps even more is going to be happening in the streets of Glasgow and around the world. COP26 will address a large number of climate issues. Here are 6 for us to think about and to track. One is about climate ambition, a second climate finance, geopolitics, gender action plan, carbon markets and offset, and net zero commitments. First, on climate ambition. The months leading up to COP26 have seen a large number of alarming reports. We've been told the world is in code red, that we need to stop fossil fuel expansion. We're headed for a 2.7 degree world, and that we need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. These reports and the evidence of our own experience have confirmed that COP26 has failed to keep the world from overheating. Instead of reducing emissions enough to safeguard the future, the challenge for COP is now expressed as keeping the prospect of 1.5 degrees alive. There are 8 countries who are responsible for 70% of the world's extraction CO2 emissions. What's their response going to be at COP26? Will COP26 lead to more ambitious targets? Will Canada get off that list? COP brings together 197 parties It brings together economic rivals. It brings together poor countries and rich countries, the big emitters with the world's most climate vulnerable. And there's a lot of attention in the lead up to COP about what head of state is going to show up. But more important than that is what actually goes on in the negotiations and what is expressed as the various negotiating blocks of COP26. The structure embodies them. You can see of them there. The first two on that list are pretty critical. If it wasn't for them, I don't think we would have the Paris Accord. At COP26, there are two ones to keep track of. One is the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and the second, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. The first is going to try to keep and shape the politics of the global north and the south, and the second going to be up against the politics of big fossil. The Climate Vulnerable Forum, a group of about 45 of the world's most climate threatened nations, has issued what it calls a climate emergency pact. Its top three demands: get a delivery plan on climate finance, shift to increases in nationally determined contributions rather than 5-year ones, and get money for loss and damage. The second coalition was launched by Costa Rica and Denmark. Its goals are to get countries to stop issuing new permits for fossil extraction, to set a deadline to phase out oil and gas. Somewhat rhetorical, but will Canada support the first? Will it join the second? A major goal of COP26 is to get rich countries to provide at least $100 billion a year to poorer countries. That's a long-standing promise. It was supposed to be achieved in 2020. In fact, climate talks and climate negotiations are built on a grand bargain between the global north and the global south. That bargain was this: big, developed emitters would support developing countries and poorer nations with money for climate action. They also committed to provide support for loss and damage from climate crisis. Those promises weren't kept, and a lot has gone wrong. There's still not enough money committed. The cumulative shortfall is growing and it's in billions of dollars. Rich countries want to provide loans, not grants. Adaptation funded. There's insufficient attention to gender and poverty, and added up, it amounts to a pretty serious betrayal of trust. Leading into COP26, Canada and Germany were assigned the leadership to address the problem. Canada was a strange choice, given our track record on this issue. But the news of the last few days suggests the effort has failed. That failure, on top of the failure to provide COVID vaccines, will have serious repercussions. A fourth issue to think about in this COP26 is the Gender Action Plan. We know that women disproportionately suffer the hardships of climate crisis. We know they bear the brunt of the economic and health consequences of the climate crisis. Since 2014, COP has been talking about this issue. In this round, there is a day to be set aside to deal with gender issues and to talk about the Gender Action Plan. We will see if it's an opportunity to make gains. But it will be one of those times that COP provides a window onto the growing international network of women's groups campaigning for climate action. One of the most problematic issues at COP is that of carbon markets. Article 6 of the Paris Accord talks about setting rules to establish such markets. And even before the Paris Accord, carbon markets has been a favored approach ever since Kyoto. In the Paris Accord, the negotiators established a framework, but they failed to get the rules in place. They failed again in COP24 to get the rules in place. They failed again in COP25 to get the rules in place. And in fact, those talks broke down over the rules. Carbon markets and international credit trading is a contentious issue, and they're contrasting and competing views. On the one hand, rich countries, carbon-intensive industry, banks, mainstream economists, some environmentalists see carbon trading and offsets as the most efficient and flexible pathway to decarbonization. Others see it as part of the problem. In this view, carbon markets allow countries and fossil fuel capital to avoid the task of shifting away fossil fuels. Article 6 is going to spark conflicts. Indigenous peoples have strongly challenged the use of international markets for carbon credits. They have argued that nature's ability to absorb carbon shouldn't be turned into a commodity that can be bought and sold. They have argued that too often carbon markets have meant green grabbing, conflicts over land and access, over land tenure, the undermining of indigenous rights, and a renewed cycle of colonial and non-sustainable development. Canada is big on climate markets, on carbon markets. This slide reproduces the UN goals for COP26. The first goal is this: keep 1.5 Celsius of warming within reach and secure net zero emissions by 2050. We have briefly addressed the first part of that. The second half speaks to the effort at COP26 to secure net zero commitments as well as the long-term strategies to achieve them. There is a growing list of countries signing on. In fact, just this week, the UK released its net zero by 2050 strategy document. This week, Australia, for the very first time, announced a commitment to net zero. So tonight, with Marc's help, we can get behind some of these dead headlines of net zero. And maybe we can even get behind this one. Getting behind the headlines to talk about what net zero is and what its implications is the thrust of tonight's discussion. Thank you.
So thank you, David, for that. That's a good setup, I think, to the transition to Marc's presentation. So, but before I introduce Marc formally and turn things over to him, I wanted to say a few words about the Q&A period that'll follow Marc's comments and presentation. We would like you to, as Sue indicated at the beginning, we'd like you to put comments or questions that you have about any aspect of Marc's presentation into the chat function. Those will be dealt with immediately following when Marc speaks. But before Marc is going, before those questions actually get dealt with, we have a number of first commenters and first questioners that will kind of bridge to the open-ended question and answer period. We have a number of people lined up, 3 people in particular: Susan Hay from Environment Halliburton, Gail Greer from Seniors for Climate Action, and Karen Sadler-Brown from the Ryerson University Climate Action Club will ask in turn, make a comment and ask a question to Marc to kind of bridge to the questions that are going to be put into the chat function. While Marc's speaking, I'll be monitoring the comments and questions in that chat box. And after the key commenters are finished, I'll start working my way through those questions and comments. I may put some questions together if they have similar themes and issues that they address. Now about tonight's featured speaker, Marc Lee. As most of you know, the concept of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions has become the preferred framework for reducing carbon emissions to levels compatible with keeping planetary warming below the Paris 2C, but preferably 1.5C target. It's been enshrined in Canada's Net Zero Accountability Act and our updated international commitments under the UN's nationally determined contribution process. But what exactly does net zero mean? And what are the implications of that approach to the achievement of the scale of emission reductions required to achieve the outcomes climate science tells us are essential to a just and sustainable future? Marc Lee is a senior economist with the British Columbia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He joined the CCPA in 1998 and is one of Canada's leading progressive commentators on economic and social policy issues. Marc led the CCPA's Climate Justice Project, which published a wide range of research on fair and effective approaches to climate action through integrating principles of social justice. Marc continues to write about climate and energy policy, as well as strategies for affordable housing. Over his career, Marc has tracked federal and provincial budgets and economic trends, publishing on a wide range of topics from poverty and inequality to globalization and international trade to public services and regulation. Marc was a classically trained economist with an MA in economics from Simon Fraser University and a BA in economics from the University of Western Ontario. But most of his time, he says, he spent arguing against the conventional wisdom in economics and policy debates. Marc is the past chair of the Progressive Economics Forum, a national network for heterodox economists, and contributes regularly to the Relentlessly Progressive Economics blog. So please join me in welcoming Marc Lee to our virtual meeting tonight. Marc, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, yeah, so thank you very much. I've been working on climate change issues for, I don't know, 13 or 14 years now. First got really interested in the issue when the Stern Review on the economics of climate change came out in the fall of, I guess it was 2006. And then shortly after that, our British Columbia Premier, Gordon Campbell, came back from a Hawaiian trip filled full of zeal around climate change. And he was running a very right-wing regressive government that cut public services and welfare rates, and was very punitive to the poorest. And that kind of gave us some of the motivation for the climate justice project, which I led from 2009 after we won a major SSHRC, or Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant, to 2016. I'm calling in today from Vancouver, the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Sometimes it's hard to be tasked to do a presentation in the evening and keep your energy going all day, but fortunately I have the time difference to my advantage, so it's still daylight out here, although it's a rainy day. It's a real honor and privilege to be asked to speak to you about this really important topic, and it's very encouraging to hear that there's a group for seniors concerned about climate action in Canada. Obviously, I actually am 51, so I'm not quite in the seniors category yet. But it is really our generation and above that has done the most to contribute to climate change, and so we have a debt of responsibility to the young people and future generations to move ahead. I was looking this up in fairly recently, and since the year I was born in 1970, we've burned about 75% of all of the fossil fuels ever extracted. In that same time period, the concentration of global carbon dioxide has gone up by a third, about 100 parts per million, and global average temperatures have increased 3/4 of a degree Celsius. We've also seen the doubling of global population in that time. So we're in a pretty serious place, and COP26 is the 26th iteration of these. They used to be annual meetings. Last year we missed one because of COVID, And to be honest, we don't have a whole lot to show for it. We do have the Paris Agreement framework, but essentially emissions have been growing year after year. So it's really a crunch time for humanity as a species. All right, so let's roll in. First figure's a little bit of a mess, but basically showing our annual greenhouse gas emissions worldwide on the up-down or vertical axis, and time in years on the bottom axis. And essentially what this is showing is the impact of the Paris Agreement to date and the shortfall. So, as David was pointing out, the Paris Agreement includes essentially all the countries of the world, but they make pledges based on what they think is possible. So you know that Canada recently changed its previous commitment, which was a 30% reduction in emissions by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. That was initially tabled when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. And we've now increased our target to a 40 to 45% reduction by 2030. So there's still a lot of work to be done to actually get the policies in place that are going to take us there. But the idea of the Paris Agreement is that countries put on the table their pledges, and that over time there's a ratcheting mechanism to increase the ambition. But going into COP26, we still have a long way to go. There's still a lot more emission reductions that we need to get to 2 degrees, a maximum of global warming, and the more aspirational target is 1.5 degrees of global warming. And we're already at about 1.2. So we don't have a whole lot of room to spare. The climate science of this is pretty simple. The more we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, the thicker that blanket of carbon dioxide becomes, and the more temperatures rise. But when we stop emitting, then we actually can stabilize that concentration in the atmosphere. And then over time, we can bring it back down. And that's kind of the impetus for the conversation around net zero. So there's a figure from the Dangerous Distractions report that we put out. It's kind of a stylized version of some other more complicated climate science stuff. But in the blue is emissions, and essentially we need to peak those emissions as quickly as possible and then ramp them down very quickly. There's different pathways to getting to net zero by mid-century, but the core idea behind net zero is that there's a sense that there will be some emissions that we simply cannot avoid, and by 2050 we can be in a net zero position by balancing those out with other types of removals. Those could be the carbon removals through nature and forests. They can be technological removals, things like carbon capture and storage or direct air capture. We'll get into all of this stuff in a little bit. Or they could be traded, as David was mentioning, through Article 6 and some kind of global carbon market, or even a bilateral agreement with another country. So these, in my opinion, are all the dangerous distractions on the way to net zero. But the core concept of net zero is one that's actually anchored in climate science. The idea is that we need to reduce our emissions as quickly as possible, but in the second half of the 21st century, we will need to be in some kind of negative emissions position. In other words, we need to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and bring it back down to the Earth's surface or below the Earth's surface. You might hear the organization 350.org, which is based on 350 parts per million being a safe boundary for human civilization. And we're currently up around 415 to 420 parts per million. So not only do we need to stop adding to the problem, adding emissions through fossil fuels into the atmosphere, we need to do things like reforestation, protecting old growth forest, protecting wetlands and croplands in order to suck carbon back out of the atmosphere. And that will get us back, hopefully, into a safe zone in terms of having a habitable planet for the future. So In my particular schematic here, this was essentially a 5% reduction in emissions going to 2080, and then flattening out after that, recognizing that there may be some things like manufacturing cement or aluminum that simply necessitates some level of emissions. And then I basically talk about, well, there could be some sort of carbon removals, starting in 2030 and then ramping up so that we hit net zero in 2050. But ultimately, the slope of those emission reductions matter. It's how quickly we get to net zero essentially determines how much damage we cause in those intervening years. And it also is dependent on, that also determines, how much we will then have to rely on carbon removals in the second half of the century. So net zero is not the end goal, but it's just a point along the pathway to negative emissions in the second half of the century. Another way of looking at this is, again, this is carbon dioxide in parts per million. And if we rolled back the clock to, essentially the early days of the Industrial Revolution, we would have carbon dioxide levels at about 286 parts per million. In those intervening decades, we've burned a lot of coal, we burned a lot of oil, we burned a lot of gas. All of that has added carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We've also engaged in a lot of deforestation, conversion of grasslands to agricultural land, and other destructive things to nature that have led to carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. If that was the end of the story, we would be, close to that 600 parts per million, but it's not. So a lot of the emissions that we put into the atmosphere get absorbed by nature. So they get absorbed by plants and trees. That's called the land sink, and they get absorbed into the ocean. So once we factor for that, then the number here in 2019 was 410 parts per million, and like I said, it's been creeping up. It's generally creeping up about 2 to 3 parts per million per year, and so we basically need to stop that dead in its tracks. This just came out the other day. When we actually measure the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, they've still gone up. Even in 2020, when we had large parts of our economy shut down for long periods of time due to COVID, there was still this increasing, and another record year for greenhouse gas emissions. So we still have a lot of work to do. So when we get into the part about what is the net and how big is the net, and what are the problems with this as a framework, I've already alluded to these already. There are natural removals, that is, mostly forests, although there's another group of what are called nature-based solutions, mostly the preservation of grasslands and wetlands. There are industrial carbon removals. So you probably have heard of the term carbon capture and storage, and also direct air capture, and we'll get into these in a sec. And then there are these internationally traded versions of the first two, which are called ITMOs, or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. Essentially, we haven't stated officially with the current government what our plans are for how much of our contribution by 2050 will come from these various sources. Generally, the number in federal circles has been about 1/5 of the effort. And this goes back to the Kyoto Protocol. When Canada was first putting forward its pledges under Kyoto, we estimated that about 1/5 of our contribution would come from our forests. And similarly, there was some modeling done by the feds in 2016. Again, about 1/5 of the action was in the form of forests and international carbon credits. So we don't know exactly what the feds are thinking for the current set of plans, but it's probably somewhere in that range. So I want to get into some of the challenges of these different approaches. First of all, when we talk about our 2030 greenhouse gas target, and you look at the reporting that the federal government has done, you find that there's actually a big chunk of the effort towards our target comes from these very sources. So Canada's claiming 17 million tons of carbon dioxide reductions from our managed forests. That is the idea that our forest base across the country is a carbon sink. It's sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that should be part of Canada's effort. And another 10 million tons from the promise to plant 2 billion trees and other nature-based solutions and agriculture. There's some problems with these, and I'll get into them in a sec. Canada made some changes in the NIR's, the National Inventory Report. So it's our official accounting of greenhouse gas emissions that we submit back to the UN. And essentially what we did was when we took our managed forest base, in recent years, there have been massive wildfires, certainly here out in British Columbia, but in other parts of the country as well. 2017, 2018, and 2021 in particular are landmark wildfire years, unlike anything in the historical record. Before the year 2000, there were wildfires, but they were very small and localized. Having the entire province on fire like it did this summer just simply never showed up before. So the federal government has basically gone and said, well, all of the land that's been affected by insect infestations like pine beetle or wildfires is essentially removed. They're not counting that for the purposes of tallying up the contribution of forests to our greenhouse gas total. So about a quarter of all of the managed forest lands are excluded. And by managed forest lands, we're basically talking about land that is logged, but also national and provincial parks. So the idea that these are natural disturbances and that they deserve to be excluded from the tally, because, well, it's just something that happened in nature, is kind of like an act of God. Of course, these aren't acts of God. They are the result of human-caused climate change. And when it comes to human-caused climate change, Canada has been punching far above its weight, both in terms of our use of fossil fuels and the amount of benefit and prosperity we've derived for them, but also as a producer of fossil fuels for which we export. And the vast majority of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the carbon we extract in the form of coal and oil and gas aren't counted in our official inventory. They're counted in the inventory of the country that imports those, whether that's the United States or China or Japan or what have you. Canada also changed the methodology for logging and the impacts of that in terms of carbon and what they call harvested wood products. Essentially what they've done is to spread out the wood that's cut every year, often decades into the future, on the basis that some of those are in very long-lasting wood products, like homes. So they may be sequestered there for many decades or possibly even centuries into the future. So nothing necessarily wrong with doing that, but it does have the impact of shifting forward some of the responsibility that we have today into the future. And so one of the challenges for net zero in 2050 is that we already have some emissions on the books because we are counting some of what we log today and in the last decade or more will then essentially be converted into carbon dioxide in the year 2050 as these cycles perpetuate themselves. So in a sense, what this kind of rigging of the books, I call it, Canada's claiming anywhere from 10 to 20 million tons per year as a carbon sink, and that this should be part of our progress to the 2030 target. But in fact, what's been happening is that if you actually bring back the fact that the managed forests in their totality, in bringing back those lands that have been affected by insects or wildfires, then Canada's forest land base is actually a massive source of carbon dioxide. So it's the opposite of a sink. That on balance, our forest lands are pulsing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and it's only by an accounting trick that we're able to claim that these are a sink for the purposes of inventory accounting. But ultimately, it doesn't matter from the perspective of the atmosphere, and we shouldn't be editing out those emissions to create a false impression that our forests are accumulating carbon every year. Forest carbon offsets in particular, but carbon offsets in general, are a problematic area. And that's essentially what we're talking about, whether they're domestic offsets, and the federal government is creating a domestic greenhouse gas protocol for forests and some other areas for the purpose of generating carbon credits that large industry can buy as part of their commitment to reduce their emissions. But essentially what we're saying is you don't actually have to reduce your emissions. You can buy your way out of it by investing in these carbon offsets. The problem is that oftentimes these carbon offsets aren't what they appear to be. They don't actually reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and in some cases are outright fraudulent. So really the only true offset that could exist is some measure that takes carbon from the atmosphere and puts it back underground permanently. I mentioned this earlier that, in order to get back down to a habitable place, we need to dramatically reduce the carbon dioxide levels worldwide. So in a sense, the trees are already spoken for. We need to do that reforestation no matter what. It's not in place of reducing fossil fuel emissions. It's in addition to doing that. The track record of carbon offsets is also pretty murky. Here in British Columbia, we had a program called Carbon Neutral Government, where we were buying forest offsets and investing in a whole bunch of other arguably sketchy measures, like energy efficiency upgrades at the Whistler Resort and Spa, and giving money to the gas company in Canada to install some new equipment in its procedures. So the BC Auditor General back in 2013 audited two projects that were representing the bulk of the carbon neutral government claim around offsets, and found that they weren't actually additional. They would have happened whether or not that money had flowed that way. And a bunch of this was preserving an old growth forest, which was genuinely a good thing to do, but it was predicated on the basis that if they didn't do that, then that forest would have been aggressively clear cut, and that was never actually going to be the case. In Alberta, their Auditor General also found a similar problem with agricultural offsets, shifts to different types of crop treatment, and found them shortcomings. And under the Kyoto Protocol, there was an offset mechanism called the Clean Development Mechanism that generated a lot of carbon credits, but the vast majority of them have found to be essentially fraudulent. And according to this one study out of Germany from the Oko Institute, 85% of the projects, couldn't really be shown to be additional. So this is why it's a dangerous distraction, is the sense that it gives you the impression that we're doing something. It allows polluters to buy their way out instead of actually genuinely reducing their emissions. And it just kicks the can down the road when we need action in the here and now. So one of the real challenges is anything that's kind of avoided, and if you're looking at old growth forests on the coast of British Columbia, they do actually suck up a certain amount of carbon every year as those forests grow. But a lot of the issues in offset markets have been avoided deforestation. So, if you picture this beautiful land on the left, as the current state of situations, and there's a polluter, let's say they're in Alberta, but they could be in Ontario or anywhere else. And by preserving that forest and not logging it, we are saying, and then selling those credits to that company, we essentially have an after situation that looks exactly like the before situation, only now we've claimed that the polluter on the right is carbon neutral or net zero. Now, the alternative is something that looks more like this. You actually do have clear cutting and you have the emitter. So that's clearly a worse situation. But this, it only preserves the status quo. It doesn't actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and therefore it's not a true carbon offset. That said, we should be preserving old growth forest as much as possible because they are great carbon sinks, and also because they represent life and biodiversity and a whole bunch of other things beyond any kind of narrow conception of carbon accounting. Now on the technological side, carbon capture and storage is one term you may have heard over the years. Sometimes they now say carbon capture utilization and storage. And the utilization means that we're not actually going to capture it and store it underground. We're just going to capture it and then use it for some other purpose. And that's not exactly the same thing, but that seems to be where the language is evolving. The oil and gas industry recently asked that the federal government pay for 75% of facilities that do carbon capture and storage. The Alberta government asking the federal government for $30 billion in subsidies to that end. And so, economists have a term called opportunity costs. And what if we could take that $30 billion and give it to the oil and gas industry to basically preserve business as usual, and then capture those emissions if we can and bury them underground? Well, why don't we just spend that $30 billion directly in investments in renewable energy and other climate action? There are also a bunch of holes in carbon capture and storage. Some of them are around the technology. So even in the best case scenario, depending on where it's sited and what type of gas you're capturing, you can get maybe 90% of the gas that's captured. So it's never a completely closed loop. In practice, in the real world, it's likely to be much less than that. The other part is that for the CCS projects that have occurred to date, the vast majority of that has not gone to store carbon underground forever and removing it from the atmosphere. It's been used to inject into old oil wells to essentially repressurize them so we can get more oil out and bring that to market. Even with that, that ability to repressurize old oil wells, the only carbon capture plant in the United States recently shut down because it was not economical to keep doing that. And there's a final element just around the scale of what it would take to do this. So sequestering just 1 gigaton, so 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and globally we're around 45 to 50 billion gigatons per year. So sequestering just like one small fraction of that would require essentially the same amount of pipeline infrastructure as all existing petroleum pipelines, according to one study. So essentially, it's a big challenge. I would argue that government should simply mandate any new oil and gas projects be equipped with carbon capture and storage, make the industry put their money where their mouths are, and then require that all current mega projects be compliant with that by 2030, but we shouldn't be subsidizing it by any means. The new darling of industrial carbon removal is direct air capture. We have a company here just outside of Vancouver called Carbon Engineering, which has built this really huge facility to test the concept. Essentially what it is imagine a whole bunch of giant fans blowing air through an industrial facility, and then what's called a sorbent, which absorbs the carbon dioxide from that. Because the CO2 is dispersed so thinly in the atmosphere, you require a lot of fans and you require a lot of electricity to power those fans. So in British Columbia, where we have abundant hydroelectricity, it is plausible that this could work. But in Alberta or other places where electricity is coming from fossil fuels, direct air capture is pretty much a non-starter in terms of having any kind of climate benefit whatsoever. Once the CO2 is captured, there's a second process that's required that heats this captured material up to 900 degrees Celsius. Then it can then release the CO2, and then it can be piped underground. But obviously this still requires fossil fuels right now to make this process happen. And the other part is there's overhead costs of building all of those fans and machinery and facilities. So there was a detailed literature review of both carbon capture and storage and direct air capture. They reviewed 30 or 40 different studies, and they found that both of them were what they call carbon additive, that when you actually look at it on the full life cycle of their operations, they actually produce more carbon emissions than they remove. So only in a very narrow accounting, if you look the other way, can it come out to being something that's a carbon removal. All of them have major issues around storage of carbon, whether that will be permanent, whether it will be leakages, whether that carbon dioxide leaches into groundwater and causes contamination or earthquakes, as we've seen with the fracking industry here in British Columbia. And they also conclude that a lot of this is being done in this sort of very market-oriented mentality, and to the extent that these technologies are possible at all, government shouldn't be treating them as a market and generating carbon offsets. We should be doing it as a public service, similar to water treatment or waste disposal. And then you add all of these together, the natural and the technological carbon removals, and imagine those traded on a worldwide basis, and you have the type of carbon markets referred to earlier that are part of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. I think Canada has long looked in various ways to international credits as a possible avenue for meeting its emission reduction targets. Certainly both Ontario and Quebec, as part of the Western Climate Initiative, were looking to buy credits from California. Only Quebec ended up joining that full system. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada and governor of the Bank of England, but also a graduate of Goldman Sachs financial firm, has been big on the idea of these global carbon markets. And he led a task force, basically calling for a 15-fold expansion of those markets and up to 2 gigatons or 2 billion tons of offsets that would be traded through various forms of sequestration and removal. So this is getting attention at the very highest levels. Whether they pull it off in Glasgow remains to be seen. I think there's a lot of disagreements around the table, but in this case, no deal is better than a deal on global carbon markets. So just to kind of wrap up, the key directions that I point out in my dangerous distractions paper, first of all, Canada needs a plan to get our domestic emissions down to actual zero or real zero, and phase out the extraction and production of fossil fuels for export, rather than indulging in various dangerous distractions. Our pathway should basically specify what kind of carbon budget we are claiming for ourselves, and how that relates to the rest of the world. I think essentially like I said earlier, the pathway to net zero matters, as well as that particular target. And really the race should be getting to zero emissions as quickly as possible, or at least minimizing total emissions between now and 2050. What we've seen so far from the federal government, and BC just issued a new climate plan, and other provinces are as well. I don't see a whole lot of kicking and screaming coming out of Calgary and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Our politicians have basically decided to have a more or less hands-off approach when it comes to the big polluters in the country. And until we actually get a handle on that, I don't think we're going to realistically meet our targets. If we are going to allow for offsets and carbon removals, they should be time limited and capped as a percentage of the total, a small percentage of the total. And we should be pushing for the highest levels of strictness associated with those. And in the case of things like forced carbon offsets, you need to actually dramatically overcompensate for the amounts that you're putting forward. So for example, in Oregon this summer, the same wildfires that plagued the West Coast burned down a number of carbon offset land areas of forests. So you can say it's an offset, but if it gets logged in the future, if it gets burned down or it's attacked by insects, then those offsets aren't any good. It may be that certain industrial sectors, it is impossible to transition off of fossil fuels, or in some cases like cement manufacture, there's carbon dioxide that's produced as a result of the chemical process. It's not necessarily burning fossil fuels. So we should identify what those sectors are, and then figure out a plan to work around them with some sort of removals. And this essentially means impossible, not necessarily actions that are more costly. We should protect old growth forests, conservation of intact forests and other nature-based solutions. There are a lot of benefits to have from this, but let's treat it as a public service. Let's not treat it as an opportunity to generate carbon offsets. And we shouldn't be counting those toward the 2050 target. In a sense, we should be keeping separate ledgers for fossil carbon and forest carbon. Don't subsidize carbon capture and storage with public funds. I think this is fairly straightforward, but already we are seeing a proposal coming to the federal parliament around a tax credit for CCS, meaning taxpayers will be asked to underwrite some of the costs that will largely aim to keep business as usual for the existing industry going as long as possible. Again, direct air capture could be supported as a public service, but it's not likely to be a major contributor to the solution. The siting and scale issues of whether you can actually do this on a large scale, and then it's going to be in someone's backyard. And I think once the reality of that sets in about how much land base would have to be allocated to direct air capture, people's enthusiasm will fall, even if it is technologically possible to do so. And I think we should be trying to do these emission reductions in Canada, not trying to somehow hope that other countries are doing more than their fair share, and that will then have a surplus of credits to sell. Most of the focus on the international scene is in countries like Brazil or Ecuador, where they have potential forest carbon. And there are huge problems with this. Even the Amazon rainforest in Brazil is now estimated that it's a carbon source, not a carbon sink. So we don't really have much time to delay, and we should avoid these dangerous distractions. This is the report I did. I think the link has been shared. I also put a link in the chat earlier to a piece that my Ottawa colleague Hadrian and I just put out around Canada going into COP26 and why it would be great for Canada to champion a new agreement that's either part of the Paris Agreement or an analog to the Paris Agreement around constraining fossil fuels and essentially winding down coal, oil, and gas as quickly as possible. That's where that publication is. My Twitter handle, if you're on that, is Marc Lee CCPA, and that's it for me. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. I think you've helped us lift the rug a little bit, more than a little bit maybe, for a lot of people with regard to what does net zero really mean and how do we distinguish it from real zero, and how do we deal with those questions of carbon markets and offsets and so on and so forth. So I just want to remind people we are taping tonight's session, and that will be available soon for various YouTube links on the net. We are also going to be having a resource list that we'll be sending out to all registered participants in the morning, probably, or sometime tomorrow. We're now going to pivot to the question and answer portion of tonight's event. Now, we only have about 15 minutes before Mark has to leave, so we're going to move fairly quickly to, we have, as I mentioned, 3 key commenters or key questioners, or first commenters and first questioners. And so very quickly, what I'd like to do is move to the first presenter or key commenter and questioner, and that will be Susan Hay from Environment Halliburton. Susan, do you want to put a quick question to Mark?
Yes, good evening, everybody, and thanks, Mark, for your excellent presentation. So first, my comment. Canada's Indigenous people have been excluded from climate policy development around the Pan-Canadian Framework Agreement on Clean Growth and Climate Change and the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy plans. Some of the proposed actions and initiatives in these plans may lead to disproportionately negative impacts to Indigenous peoples and violations of Indigenous rights. Having finally adopted the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights, Canada is now legally bound to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples to any use of the resources on their lands. So my question is, to what extent do you think the Canadian government proposes to involve Indigenous people in the counting of their lands and forests as carbon offsets for Canada's share of global emissions?
Really good question. There was a great report by Indigenous Climate Action that looks precisely at those issues of how First Nations and Indigenous people were excluded from the Pan-Canadian framework and the more recent Healthy Economy, Healthy Environment package of climate proposals. I mean, there's the whole essence of Canada and the Crown. Like, I note that the ministers who were just sworn into the new cabinet or just getting sworn in still have to pledge allegiance to the Queen of England and her heirs and successors. You know, the whole project of Canada is stealing land and taking resources. That's kind of the model. And so, you know, even if you're attaching concepts like free, prior, and informed consent and UNDRIP into that, I think it's still largely within this colonial context. And so Canada's come some ways in terms of rhetoric and acknowledging Indigenous rights, but they make them prove it in court and draw these things out year after year after year. You know, here in British Columbia, there's a major pipeline that's being blocked in the north, linking the fracking fields in the northeast of the province with the proposed LNG, or liquefied natural gas, Canada facility in Kitimat. And essentially, they're just trying to ram through this pipeline. Similarly with the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, which has been opposed by the Tsleil-Waututh and many First Nations along that pipeline corridor. and still is as a violation. When push comes to shove, the Crown does what it wants to do over the objections of Aboriginal people. In forests, there have been some interesting developments on the coast where there has been some money flowing to First Nations as an alternative to logging the lands that they hold. And there's certainly a lot of interest in the First Nations here in being part of those. I still have concerns that those are not, that will lead to sort of bogus carbon offsets, even though it's the right thing to do to be able to give land back and have greater First Nation stewardship. If it's being done to generate carbon offset credits, then I think it's still very problematic.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so thank you, Susan. Now we're going to move on to Gail Greer from SCAN. Gail, do you want to put your question quickly and succinctly to Mark? You're mute. Oh,
Sorry, yes. Well, I'd also like to thank you, Mark, for your analysis. I agree with your critique of the whole concept of net zero and see the idea of creating natural and engineered solutions and offsets as really a modern day system of indulgences that permit governments and private corporations, especially financial asset managers and bankers, to feel good while they continue to profit from the production and use of fossil fuels. You know, we do already have such markets, trading regimes. You mentioned a couple. There's the European emissions trading system and the California Quebec cap and trade system, as well as some very opaque, voluntary, over-the-counter trading systems. You know, for example, Air Canada offers travelers the option of offsetting greenhouse gas emissions caused by their flights through a little-known company called less.ca. If you go to their website, the price today, $20 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents. Half the price that our own government now sets on carbon, which is itself among the lowest prices on carbon in the world. Talk about inefficient markets and perverse incentives. The question I have is whether you think the 2015 Paris Agreement Article 6 requirement to establish carbon offsets or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes will succeed at COP26. The effort to develop measurement and accounting rules for such offsets and their exchange failed at several COPs after Paris, including the last one in Madrid in 2019. So have particular countries or organizations been charged with developing those rules? What role, if any, is the Government of Canada playing in the development of the rules? Do we have specific departments that are involved? Or has that task been contracted out to, you know, the major accounting corporations in the world or standards organizations like the CSO? In other words, who's writing the rules for net zero?
Okay, thanks. Great question. I'll try to give the short answer. I don't know if there will be an agreement in Glasgow on Article 6. From what I've been reading, there's still a lot of division among the parties around it. However, a lot of the bigger polluting countries feel very motivated to create this carbon market. And it could be one of those situations where they have now, as David mentioned earlier on, there was this pledge to $100 billion per year in climate finance to support, adapting to climate change that's already kind of in the system and to support efforts of poor countries to reduce their emissions. And so they've now cobbled together, after many broken promises, this framework that says by 2023, we'll start to be providing $100 billion per year. So they may try to use that as leverage in order to twist arms to get people to sign on to something like a carbon market. I mean, that's typically how the geopolitics plays out in these negotiations. It's very similar to the World Trade Organization in terms of those dynamics and which blocks are there. I feel like the poor countries, or the southern or developing countries, however you want to call them, have been pretty good at resisting this up to that point, and some see it as an attempt at almost like recolonization, because vast tracts of their land would be essentially converted into tree plantations, or preserved in some way. Obviously, the historical record is also really bad for Indigenous people in those areas. Even though I talked about some successes here in BC with Indigenous people in forests, in a lot of other parts of the world, it's been an utter disaster in terms of excluding people from their traditional lands. But I think you're right that the prospect of this multi-billion dollar, maybe multi-trillion dollar market in offsets has a lot in the banking industry and the accounting industry and other business just drooling with the opportunity. So you think about the money that banks make off your mutual funds and your retirement savings, a few percentage points a year that they skim off the top. It's a lot of big money to be made. And I think that's probably what's driving. And that's why Mark Carney is one of the backers of that.
Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left. Thank you, by the way, Gail, for that question. We can only lift up the rug a little bit on something which we could spend an entire evening on, any one of these questions for sure. So you've only got a couple of minutes before you have to leave, Mark. So I'm going to call on Karen Sadler-Brown from the Ryerson Climate Action Group to put a question as succinctly and as quickly as she can in the remaining time that we have.
Mark, I thought your report was excellent, and it really should be on the required reading list for the new minister. Thank you very much. My question is, by far the most challenging but critical industrial policy that the Liberals promised was to cap and then reduce emissions from oil and gas production. Do you have any recommendations for the new minister on how he's going to proceed in the face of what is likely to be significant and an intransigent government of Alberta, probably Saskatchewan, certainly supported by the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, I think a cap is exactly the right way to be addressing the emissions from a particular sector. I guess I'm a little cynical about how that gets implemented. And it was a very vague commitment in the Liberal election platform. Here in BC, we just released a climate plan update this week, which also talks in vague terms about a cap on oil and gas emissions, but has nothing else to say in terms of policy or programs that are going to make that happen. So it's all well and good to say we have a target if you don't have any plans to make it. I mean, that was the essence of Canadian climate policy for decades. I think we have improved at the federal level under the Trudeau government. We actually have some bona fide climate policies. Time will tell whether they can get us to the targets that we've set. And I'm also skeptical on that front. But until we have concrete plans to actually reduce those emissions, and I think, again, like a managed wind down framework for the sector that deals with the worker transition issues, and ideally trying to coordinate that with other countries through an international supply agreement. I see someone in the chat mentioned an initiative by Sapor Berman, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which will resonate for many around, the proliferation of nuclear weapons back in the day as an analog to that. But that is essentially the collective action problem, because right now, every government sitting on fossil fuels wants to get those to market as quickly as possible, because maybe we can't get them to market 20 years from now or 30 years from now. So we actually have this situation where governments are incentivized to pump fossil fuels in the marketplace, and that's not helpful at all.
So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there because Mark has to go very quickly. So I'm going to say to all the folks that put something in the chat, we're going to try to get you some kind of a response to the questions as best we can. And with that, just apologize for not having the time to get into them. And I'm just going to turn the meeting over to Susan Hay to thank Mark and to say the good nights and thank yous. Over to you, Susan.
Hey, thanks, Terry. That was a really interesting evening, and I'd like to thank David Robertson, first of all, for his excellent presentation on COP26, and our featured speaker, Marc Lee, for his incisive analysis of net zero and its pitfalls. I'm hoping that something positive will come out of COP26, but I wish that the politicians making decisions on behalf of Canada could hear Mark's presentation before they head off to Glasgow. And I'd also like to thank the other two commenter and questioners, Gail Greer of SCAN and Karen Sadler-Brown of the leadership team of the Climate Action Club of Ryerson. I'm sure we all know a lot more about the concept of net zero after tonight's presentations. I'd also like to thank Terry Moore for curating the questions and for his role in organizing and presenting tonight's event, and to Eric Lilius for his expert handling of the Zoom controls, and to Sue McKenzie from Climate Action Muskoka for the land acknowledgement and introductions. And last but not least, thank you, our participants, for listening and your willingness to become better informed about issues that we don't seem to have much control over until the next election anyway. Our three groups, Climate Action Muskoka, Seniors for Climate Action Now, and Environment Halberton, all work hard for climate justice, and we are able to do the work that we do through memberships in our organizations and through your donations. So if you feel inclined, please support whichever organization you feel attached to. We appreciate it. And as this evening draws to a close, I wish you a good evening, and we at Environment Halberton hope to see you in November. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.